The steam whistle shrieked across the high mountain valley as the locomotive pulled into Gunnison, Colorado, on a bitterly cold March afternoon in 1883. And from the third class car emerged a young woman whose tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall to the wooden platform below. Eleanor Grace clutched her worn carpetbag with trembling fingers, her thin shawl offering little protection against the cutting wind that swept down from the Rockies. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia, each mile taking her farther from everything she had known and closer to a future she now dreaded with every fiber of her being. The letter in her reticule, creased from countless readings, promised a respectable marriage to a ranch owner named Harold Pemberton. What it had not mentioned was that Mr. Pemberton had died 3 weeks ago in a hunting accident, and his brother had sent a terse telegram to the station master informing any arriving bride that her services were no longer required. The station master, a portly man with sympathetic eyes, had delivered this news with obvious discomfort, pressing $2 into her palm as though the coins could somehow compensate for her shattered hopes. Eleanor had no family to return to, no money for passage back east, and winter still held the high country in its merciless grip. She stood on that platform feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her 22 years, her dreams of a new life crumbling like ash in the wind. Through her tears, she barely noticed the tall figure approaching until a shadow fell across her face. She looked up to find a man standing before her, his broad shoulders blocking the weak afternoon sun. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with snow, dark hair curling from beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and his face bore the weathered look of someone who spent his life outdoors. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking gray-blue that held an intensity tempered with unexpected gentleness. "Madam," he said, his voice a deep rumble that somehow carried warmth despite the cold, "I could not help but notice your distress. Are you hurt?" Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Fresh tears spilled down her face, and she hated herself for this display of weakness before a stranger. She shook her head, unable to form words past the knot of despair that threatened to choke her. The man removed his hat, revealing more of his face. He looked to be in his late 20s, with strong features that might have seemed harsh were it not for the concern evident in his expression. "My name is Matthew Walsh. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of town. Whatever has brought you to tears, I want you to know something." He paused, and his next words were spoken with quiet conviction. "Nobody makes you cry here. Not while I am standing, not while there is breath in my body. Whatever trouble has found you, you are not alone in facing it." His words, so unexpected and so earnest, broke something open inside Eleanor. She found herself telling him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. She spoke of her parents' death from typhoid fever the previous year, of the factory work that had barely kept her fed, of the advertisement she had answered in desperation, and of the news she had received just moments ago. Matthew listened without interruption, his steady gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The wind howled around them, and other passengers hurried past toward the warmth of the town's buildings. Finally, he spoke. "The Palace Hotel on Main Street is respectable and clean. Mrs. Henderson, who runs it, is a good woman. I will pay for a room for you tonight and leave money for your meals. That will give you time to decide what you want to do next, without the pressure of immediate need clouding your judgment." "I cannot accept charity from a stranger," Eleanor protested, though even as she spoke the words, she knew she had little choice. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "It is not charity," Matthew replied. "Consider it a loan to be repaid when you are able. Or do not consider it a loan at all. Consider it what any decent person would do for another human being in distress." He gestured toward the main street. "Come. You are freezing, and this cold can be dangerous for those not accustomed to it." Eleanor found herself walking beside him, her shorter legs struggling to match his long stride through the snow-packed streets. Gunnison was a mining town, bustling despite the cold, with false-fronted buildings lining both sides of the wide main thoroughfare. Miners and cowboys mingled with shopkeepers and families, all moving with the purposeful haste of people who understood that mountain winters did not tolerate dawdling. The Palace Hotel was a 2-story structure with white-painted walls and green shutters. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense manner that softened when Matthew explained Eleanor's situation. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself in a small but spotlessly clean room with a real bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. Matthew had departed after securing her accommodations, promising to return the next day to check on her welfare. Alone in the room, Eleanor finally allowed herself to fully feel the weight of her situation. She had been so certain that becoming a mail-order bride was the answer to her problems, so sure that marriage to a Colorado rancher would provide the security and purpose she desperately sought. Now she was stranded in an unfamiliar town, dependent on the kindness of a stranger, with no clear path forward. Yet as she lay in the comfortable bed that night, she found herself thinking not of her misfortune but of Matthew Walsh's words, "Nobody makes you cry here." There had been such conviction in his voice, such genuine concern in his eyes. She had met many men in Philadelphia, but none who would have shown such compassion to a stranger. Morning brought clearer skies and slightly warmer temperatures. Eleanor washed with the water from the pitcher on her washstand, noting that her single change of clothes was hardly suitable for the mountain climate. She made her way downstairs to find Mrs. Henderson serving breakfast in the small dining room. "Mr. Walsh paid for your meals, dear, so you eat your fill," the older woman said, setting down a plate of eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits. "He is a good man, Matthew Walsh. Lost his parents to scarlet fever 5 years back and has run the ranch alone ever since. Works harder than any 3 men combined and never asks for help from anyone. The fact that he stopped to aid you speaks well of his character." Eleanor ate slowly, savoring food that was far better than anything she had tasted in months. Other guests came and went, and she listened to their conversations, learning about the town and its inhabitants. Gunnison had grown rapidly since the railroad arrived, transforming from a small cattle town into a hub for mining operations in the surrounding mountains. It was rough but growing, full of people seeking their fortunes or simply trying to survive. She was finishing her second cup of coffee when Matthew appeared in the doorway. He looked different in daylight, his face showing the lines of someone who spent long hours in sun and wind. He removed his hat upon seeing her and approached with an almost shy hesitation. "Miss Grace, I hope you rested well." "I did, thank you, and please call me Eleanor." "Eleanor, then." He sat down across from her, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Henderson with a nod of thanks. "I have been thinking about your situation. I have a proposal that might benefit both of us, though I want you to understand there is no pressure for you to accept." Eleanor set down her cup, giving him her full attention. Matthew turned the coffee cup in his hands, as though gathering his thoughts. Running a ranch alone is manageable but difficult, especially during the winter months. I need help, particularly with the household duties. Cooking, cleaning, mending, the kinds of work that I frankly do poorly because I lack the skill and the time. What I am proposing is employment, not marriage. You would work as my housekeeper with your own room in the house and a fair wage. After a few months, You would have enough money to decide your own future, whether that means staying here or traveling elsewhere. Eleanor studied his face, searching for any sign of improper intentions. She found only earnest honesty. You would trust a complete stranger in your home. I am a good judge of character, Matthew replied. And Mrs. Henderson has already made inquiries on your behalf. The station master confirmed your story, and your manner speaks of good upbringing. More importantly, I heard the truth in your words yesterday. You are someone who has fallen on hard times through no fault of your own, and you deserve a chance to rebuild your life. What would people say? A single woman living on your ranch, even as a housekeeper. Let them say what they will. Anyone who knows me knows I conduct myself with honor. And anyone who would judge you for accepting honest work is not worth your concern. He met her eyes directly. I will not lie and say this would be easy. Ranch life is hard, especially up in the high country. The work is constant, the weather can be brutal, and the isolation takes getting used to. But you would be safe, fed, and paid fairly for your labor. What you decide to do after that would be entirely your choice. Eleanor thought of the alternatives. She could try to find work in town, but jobs for single women were limited and often involved the kind of establishments she wanted no part of. She could attempt to return east, but with what money? And to what end? There was nothing waiting for her there but more factory work and grinding poverty. At least on Matthew's ranch, she would have time to think, to plan, to build up resources for whatever came next. I accept, she said, but I insist on doing the work properly. I will not take charity disguised as employment. For the first time, Matthew smiled, and the expression transformed his face. I would expect nothing less. Can you be ready to leave this afternoon? The weather is clear now, but another storm is predicted for tomorrow. They departed Gunnison 3 hours later in a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 massive draft horses. Eleanor wore a heavy coat that Mrs. Henderson had insisted she take, claiming it had belonged to her daughter who had moved to Denver and no longer needed it. Her carpetbag, looking even more shabby against the wagon's bed, held all her worldly possessions. The road north followed a frozen creek through a valley of stunning beauty. Mountains rose on all sides, their peaks white with snow that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Aspens stood bare and silver among the dark pines, and once Eleanor spotted a small herd of elk watching them from a hillside. Matthew pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice filled with obvious love for the land. My father homesteaded here in '68, he explained. Everyone thought he was crazy, choosing land this far into the mountains. But he saw the potential. Good grazing in the summer, protected valleys for the winter, and water that never runs dry. He built the ranch from nothing, and I intend to honor his work by making it thrive. Do you have any siblings? Eleanor asked. A sister, Margaret. She married a merchant in Denver 3 years ago. We write occasionally, but the distance makes visits difficult. He glanced at her. What about you? Any family at all? None living. I was an only child, and both my parents came from small families. When the fever took them, I truly was alone. I am sorry. That is a hard burden to carry. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the steady clip of hooves, and the whisper of wind through the trees. Eleanor found herself relaxing despite her uncertain situation. There was something solid and dependable about Matthew Walsh, a steadiness that she had not encountered in many people. The ranch appeared as they crested a rise, and Eleanor caught her breath at the sight. The main house was a log structure, larger than she had expected, with a covered porch and windows that caught the late afternoon light. A barn stood nearby, substantial and well-maintained, along with several outbuildings. A split-rail fence enclosed corrals, and beyond them stretched meadows that even under their blanket of snow suggested rich grazing land. Mountains formed a dramatic backdrop, and a creek, the same one they had followed from town, curved through the property. "It is beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "It is home," Matthew replied, and there was deep satisfaction in his voice. "Come, I will show you the house." The interior was simpler than the exterior suggested, but clean and functional. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. Simple furniture, clearly handmade, was arranged practically rather than decoratively. A hallway led to 3 bedrooms, and Matthew showed her to one at the back of the house. "This was my sister's room. It has not been used since she left, but I have kept it clean. You can arrange it however you like." The room was small but pleasant, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Eleanor set down her carpetbag and turned to find Matthew watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I know I have said it before, but I truly mean it. You have shown me more kindness than I had any right to expect." "We all need help sometimes," Matthew said. "The measure of a person is not whether they stumble, but whether they rise when offered a hand up. Something tells me you are someone who will not only rise but soar." He moved toward the door. "I need to tend to the horses and check on the cattle. Make yourself at home, and I will return in time for supper. If you feel up to cooking, the pantry is well stocked. If not, I can manage something simple." "I will cook," Eleanor assured him. "It is what you hired me for, after all." After he left, Eleanor explored the house more thoroughly. The kitchen was better equipped than she had expected, with a modern cast iron stove, plenty of pots and pans, and a pantry that indeed held a substantial supply of staples. She found flour, dried beans, salt pork, canned vegetables, and even some dried apples. Clearly, Matthew had prepared well for the winter. She set about making supper, finding a strange comfort in the familiar tasks. As she worked, she thought about the sudden turn her life had taken. Just 24 hours ago, she had stepped off that train expecting to meet her intended husband. Instead, she had found herself crying on a station platform, her future in ruins. Yet here she was now in a warm house in the mountains, preparing a meal in her new workplace. Life, she reflected, moved in mysterious ways. Matthew returned as the sun was setting, stamping snow from his boots on the porch. He paused in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. The kitchen table was set for 2. A pot of stew bubbled on the stove, and fresh biscuits cooled on a rack. Eleanor was stirring the stew, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "It smells wonderful," Matthew finally said. "I cannot remember the last time I came home to a proper meal." They ate together, the conversation flowing more easily than Eleanor would have expected. Matthew talked about the ranch, explaining his plans for expanding the herd and improving the breeding stock. Eleanor spoke about Philadelphia, describing the city that was so different from this wild mountain valley. She found herself laughing at his descriptions of local characters, and he seemed genuinely interested in her stories of city life. After supper, Matthew retreated to the barn to complete evening chores while Eleanor cleaned the kitchen. She worked efficiently, finding satisfaction in the simple task of washing dishes and putting the kitchen to rights. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the barn and occasionally Matthew's silhouette as he moved about his work. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Eleanor listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. The wind moaned around the eaves, horses moved in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. It was so different from the constant noise of Philadelphia, where street sounds never fully ceased. Here, the silence between sounds was profound and somehow soothing. The days settled into a rhythm. Eleanor woke early to start breakfast, and Matthew would come in from morning chores with tales of cattle that had wandered, fence lines that needed mending, or tracks he had spotted in the snow. After breakfast, he would head out to work on the endless tasks that running a ranch demanded, while Eleanor tackled the household duties. She cleaned, cooked, mended clothes that had been neglected for months, and slowly began to put her own stamp on the house. Winter gradually released its grip on the high country. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes, and the creek ran high with runoff. The days grew longer, and while snow still fell occasionally, it was interspersed with days of brilliant sunshine that hinted at the spring to come. Eleanor found herself adapting to the rhythm of ranch life, discovering strengths she had not known she possessed. Matthew proved to be a considerate employer and, increasingly, a friend. He treated her with unfailing respect, never making her feel like a servant but rather a valued partner in the ranch's operation. He taught her about the land and the animals, showing her how to read the weather in the clouds that built over the peaks, how to distinguish the tracks of deer from elk, and how to spot cattle that needed extra attention. For her part, Eleanor transformed the house. What had been a functional bachelor dwelling became a true home. She sewed curtains for the windows, reorganized the kitchen for greater efficiency, and began a garden plot near the house, preparing the soil for spring planting. She discovered a love for the wide open spaces, the crisp mountain air, and the profound silence that allowed her to hear her own thoughts clearly for the first time in years. But more than anything, she found herself drawn to Matthew Walsh. She noticed the way his face softened when he spoke about his parents, the patience he showed with animals, and the fierce pride he took in his work. She saw how he never shirked a task, no matter how difficult, and how he treated everyone he encountered with basic human decency. He was, she realized, the kind of man she had always hoped existed but had begun to doubt she would ever meet. One evening in early April, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose, Matthew turned to her with an unusual hesitancy in his manner. "Eleanor, I need to say something, and I ask that you hear me out before you respond." She set down her mending, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Of course. You have been here for 6 weeks now. In that time, you have transformed not just my house but my life. I look forward to coming inside at the end of the day, knowing you will be there. I find myself thinking of things I want to tell you while I am working, saving up stories and observations like treasure. When I am in town, I look for things that might please you. When I am mending fence or checking cattle, half my mind is wondering what you are doing, if you are happy, if you are content." He paused, his hands gripping the porch railing. "I know you came here as an employee, and I have tried to respect that boundary. But I cannot continue to pretend that what I feel for you is merely the appreciation of an employer for a good worker. I am falling in love with you, Eleanor Grace. Maybe I have been falling in love with you since I saw you crying on that platform and felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I want to make you smile, to protect you from harm, to share my life and my dreams with you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had felt the growing connection between them, but had told herself it was merely gratitude, companionship, the natural result of two lonely people sharing a space. But hearing Matthew voice his feelings stripped away her self-deception. She had been falling in love with him too, perhaps from that first moment when he had promised that nobody would make her cry. "Matthew," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I left Philadelphia, I thought I was traveling toward a practical arrangement. a marriage of convenience that would provide security in exchange for companionship and household management. I told myself that love was a luxury, something for poets and dreamers, not for desperate orphans with nowhere else to turn. She stood and moved to stand beside him at the railing, looking out at the mountains that had become so dear to her. But these weeks with you have taught me I was wrong. Love is not a luxury. It is the point of everything, and I have found it here in this wild, beautiful place with a man who saw me at my lowest moment and offered not judgment but kindness. She turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. I love you, Matthew Walsh. I love your strength and your gentleness, your dedication and your dreams. I love the life we have built here, even in these few short weeks. And if you are asking what I think you are asking, then my answer is yes. Yes, with all my heart. Matthew's face transformed with joy. He reached out, cupping her face gently in his work-roughened hands. I am asking, Eleanor Grace, will you marry me? Not as a mail-order bride accepting an arrangement, but as a woman choosing a life with a man who loves her more than words can express. Yes, Eleanor whispered, and then his lips were on hers, and the kiss held all the promise of the spring that was finally arriving in the high country. They were married 3 weeks later in Gunnison, in a simple ceremony at the small church on the edge of town. Mrs. Henderson stood up as Eleanor's witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring that she had known from the start that things would work out this way. Several ranchers who were Matthew's neighbors attended, along with the shopkeepers and townsfolk who had come to know Eleanor during her trips to town for supplies. Eleanor wore a dress of sky blue that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Matthew wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and slightly uncomfortable. But when he looked at his bride, his eyes held such love and wonder that Eleanor felt tears prick her own eyes, though these were tears of joy rather than despair. The preacher spoke the traditional words, and Eleanor marveled at how different this ceremony was from what she had imagined when she first answered that advertisement. She had been prepared to marry a stranger, to build a life on duty and obligation. Instead, she was marrying her best friend, her love, the man who had seen her tears and refused to let her face the world alone. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the hotel. Mrs. Henderson had outdone herself with the food, and there was music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Eleanor found herself pulled from one partner to another, as the local men insisted on dancing with the new bride. But her eyes kept finding Matthew across the room, and the look they exchanged needed no words. Finally, as the moon rose over the mountains, they climbed into the wagon for the ride home. The night was clear and cold, the stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Matthew drove with one arm around Eleanor, holding her close against the chill, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling a contentment she had never known before. The house welcomed them home, and Matthew carried her over the threshold with a laugh. He set her down gently in the main room, but before she could speak, he was kissing her again, his hands tangling in her hair. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, and Eleanor felt heat flood through her body. She had been married before only in the technical, legal sense. This was her true wedding night with a man she loved desperately. Matthew pulled back, his breathing ragged. "Are you sure? We can wait if you need time." In answer, Eleanor took his hand and led him to the bedroom they would now share, the room that had been his alone but would now be theirs together. She turned to face him, her hands moving to the buttons of her dress. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, they came together with a passion tempered by tenderness, learning each other's bodies with wonder and delight. Matthew was patient and gentle, attentive to her needs and pleasure, and Eleanor discovered that the physical expression of love could be something beautiful rather than merely a duty. They made love twice more before dawn, each time discovering new depths to their connection, and finally fell asleep tangled together as the first light touched the mountain peaks. The spring and summer passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Eleanor threw herself into the life of the ranch with enthusiasm, learning to ride a horse, helping with the cattle when extra hands were needed, and maintaining a garden that flourished in the rich mountain soil. Matthew expanded the herd, and together they made improvements to the ranch buildings. But more than the work, it was the small moments that defined their life together. Mornings where they woke wrapped in each other's arms. Evenings on the porch, watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. The way Matthew would catch her around the waist as she worked in the kitchen, pulling her close for a kiss. The way Eleanor would run out to meet him when he returned from a long day checking fence lines, her face lighting up with joy at his return. They had their challenges, of course. A late spring blizzard killed several calves, and they spent 3 days fighting to save the rest of the herd. Eleanor came down with a fever in June that terrified Matthew until she recovered, weak, but insisting on returning to her regular routine far sooner than he thought wise. They had their first real argument when Matthew wanted to invest in more breeding cattle, and Eleanor thought they should save the money as a cushion against disaster. But even their arguments only served to strengthen their bond. They learned to fight fairly, to listen to each other's perspectives, and to find compromises that worked for both of them. And the making up after an argument was always sweet, often ending in Matthew carrying Eleanor to bed with a wicked grin and Eleanor laughing and protesting that they had work to do, even as she wrapped her arms around his neck. In late July, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had wanted to be certain before saying anything. When she finally told Matthew, he whooped with joy, picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down with a worried expression and asked if spinning her had been bad for the baby. "Matthew Walsh, I am pregnant, not made of glass," Eleanor laughed. "But yes, you can hold me. In fact, I insist on it." He obliged, wrapping his arms around her and resting his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he murmured in wonder. "Our baby, I can hardly believe it." "Believe it," Eleanor said. "By February, there will be 3 of us." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Eleanor continued with most of her regular work, though Matthew hovered anxiously whenever she did anything he deemed remotely strenuous. As her belly grew, she found herself having to reassure him repeatedly that women had been having babies for millennia, and that she was healthy and strong. The other ranchers' wives welcomed Eleanor warmly, sharing advice and baby clothes, and she found herself building friendships that eased the isolation of ranch life. Mrs. Henderson sent packages from town with tiny clothes she had knitted, along with letters full of maternal advice. Winter returned to the high country, but this year Eleanor faced it with joy rather than dread. The house was warm and cozy, the pantry well stocked, and every evening she sat with Matthew by the fire, his hand resting on her belly to feel the baby kick. They debated names endlessly, finally agreeing that if it was a boy, they would name him John after Matthew's father, and if a girl, she would be Lily after Eleanor's mother. On a frigid night in mid-February, Eleanor's labor began. Matthew rode through the darkness to fetch Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Morrison from town, his heart in his throat as he pushed the horse as fast as he dared on the icy roads. He returned to find Eleanor pacing the bedroom, her face determined despite the obvious pain. Mrs. Henderson took charge with the calm efficiency of a woman who had assisted at dozens of births. She shooed Matthew out of the room, ignoring his protests that he wanted to stay with his wife. Eleanor called out that she wanted him there, and the older woman relented with the condition that he make himself useful by keeping the fire going and water boiling. The labor was long and difficult. Eleanor bore it with a courage that awed Matthew, though he felt helpless in the face of her pain. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, and whispered encouragement, all while feeling utterly inadequate to the moment. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, a baby's cry filled the house. Mrs. Henderson beamed as she held up a squalling infant. "It is a boy, a healthy, strong boy." Matthew looked down at Eleanor, her face exhausted but radiant, and felt tears stream down his face. "You did it," he whispered. "You are amazing." "We did it," Eleanor corrected, squeezing his hand. "Can I hold him?" Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, and both parents stared in wonder at their son. He had a shock of dark hair like Matthew's and was screaming with impressive volume. "John," Matthew said softly. "Welcome to the world, John Walsh." The baby seemed to calm at the sound of his father's voice, and his eyes, still unfocused, turned toward the sound. Eleanor laughed through her tears, holding their son close. "He knows you already." The weeks after John's birth were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Matthew discovered reserves of patience he had not known he possessed, walking the floor with a crying infant at 3 in the morning, changing diapers with fumbling hands, and staring in wonder at the tiny person who had transformed their lives. Eleanor recovered her strength quickly, though she was often exhausted from the demands of caring for an infant. But even in her tiredness, there was a deep happiness that seemed to radiate from her. She would nurse their son while sitting by the window, looking out at the mountains, and Matthew would watch them both and feel his heart swell with emotion too large for words. As spring arrived once more, John grew and thrived. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, and showed signs of inheriting both his father's sturdy build and his mother's bright intelligence. Matthew built a cradle that sat in their bedroom at night and in the main room during the day, and Eleanor sewed a seemingly endless supply of tiny clothes. One evening in late April, as they sat on the porch with John sleeping in Eleanor's arms, Matthew turned to his wife with a contemplative expression. "You ever think about that day at the train station, about how we met?" Eleanor looked up from their sleeping son. "I think about it often. I was so lost, so certain that my life was over, and then you appeared and changed everything." "I remember seeing you crying," Matthew said, "and feeling like I had been struck by lightning. I did not understand it then, but I think some part of me knew, even in that first moment, that you were going to be the most important person in my life." "Nobody makes you cry here," Eleanor quoted softly. "That was what you said to me, and you were right. I have not cried from sorrow since that day. Happy tears, yes, but never from pain or despair." She reached out and took his hand. "You saved me, Matthew, not just from practical difficulties, but from a life without love, without purpose, without joy. You gave me everything." "No," Matthew disagreed gently. "We saved each other. I was alone, going through the motions of life, but not truly living. You taught me what it means to have a home, not just a house. To have love, not just routine. To have hope for the future." John stirred in Eleanor's arms, making the small snuffling sounds that usually preceded waking. Eleanor shifted him gently, and his eyes opened, looking up at his parents with that unfocused infant gaze that somehow always seemed wise beyond his minutes. "What do you think, little one?" Eleanor murmured. "Are we not the luckiest people in the world?" The years flowed like the creek that ran through their property, sometimes rushing and turbulent, sometimes calm and steady, but always moving forward. John grew into a sturdy boy with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's quick smile. 2 years after his birth, Eleanor gave birth to twin girls, Anna and Rose, who kept the household in delightful chaos with their mischievous ways. The ranch prospered under Matthew's careful management and Eleanor's practical wisdom. They expanded their land holdings, built a new barn, and earned a reputation for breeding quality cattle. Matthew was elected to serve on the town council, and Eleanor helped establish a school in Gunnison, teaching there 2 days a week once the children were old enough. But for all their success and growth, what mattered most was the love that continued to deepen between them. They still took time to sit on the porch in the evenings, though now children played in the yard before them. They still laughed together over small things, still reached for each other in the night, still found joy in the everyday moments of their shared life. When John was 8, old enough to be curious about family history, he asked his mother about how she and his father had met. Eleanor pulled him onto her lap despite his protests that he was too big for such things, and told him the story. "I arrived in Gunnison on the saddest day of my life," she began. "I had traveled so far, hoping for a new beginning, only to find that the future I had planned was impossible. I stood on that train platform crying, feeling more alone than I had ever felt. And then Papa found you." John asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it again. "Then your Papa found me. He walked up to me, this stranger, and he said something I will never forget. He said, 'Nobody makes you cry here,' and from that moment my life changed. He gave me hope when I had none, kindness when I expected judgment, and eventually, a love I had never dared to dream of. Papa is the best," John declared with the fierce loyalty of a child. "He is," Eleanor agreed, looking across the room to where Matthew was helping the twins build a tower of blocks. "But do you know what else?" "What?" "We are all the best together. Your Papa and I found each other, and then we found you and your sisters, and together we are a family. That is the real magic of the story. Not just that 2 people fell in love, but that love grew into all of this." She gestured around the room, encompassing the house, the ranch, their whole life together. John seemed satisfied with this answer and ran off to play. Eleanor stood, stretching, and caught Matthew watching her with that expression that still made her heart skip after all these years. "What?" she asked, though she already knew. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," he replied. "How different my life would have been if I had not gone to town that particular day, if I had not seen you on that platform." "Fate," Eleanor said, crossing the room to sit beside him. "Or providence, or simply luck. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it every single day." Matthew pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "As am I, my love. As am I." The children grew, and the ranch flourished. John proved to have his father's instinct for the land and his mother's head for business. The twins, while different in temperament, were inseparable and kept their parents alternately laughing and tearing their hair out with their adventures. There were hard times, of course. A drought one year tested their resources. A fall from a horse left Matthew with a broken leg that worried Eleanor sick until it healed properly. The twins both came down with measles, and for a terrifying week, Eleanor and Matthew took turns sitting up with them through the night. But they weathered every storm together, their bond strengthening with each challenge overcome. They learned that love was not just the passion of their early days, though that never fully faded, but also the quiet comfort of a hand held in the dark, the teamwork of running a household and raising children, and the deep knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. When Eleanor turned 40, Matthew surprised her with a trip to Denver. It was the first time they had traveled together without the children, leaving them in the capable hands of Mrs. Henderson, who had become like a grandmother to them. They stayed in a fine hotel, attended the theater, and spent 3 glorious days simply being Matthew and Eleanor, not Mama and Papa. On their last night, as they walked through the city streets with Eleanor's hand tucked into Matthew's arm, she stopped suddenly and turned to look at him. "What would you say if I told you I wanted to write a book?" she asked. Matthew looked surprised but intrigued. "I would say that I think you should write whatever you want to write. You have always had a way with words. What kind of book?" "About women who came west," Eleanor said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. "Mail-order brides, prospectors' wives, teachers, and shopkeepers. All the women who left everything they knew to build new lives in wild country. Their stories deserve to be told." "Then tell them," Matthew said simply. "I will help however I can." And so Eleanor began writing, stealing hours between household duties to set down the stories of the women she had met over the years. She wrote of courage and heartbreak, of loneliness and love, of hardship overcome and dreams realized. And though she changed names and details, at the heart of it all was her own story, of a young woman who stepped off a train crying and found a man who refused to let her face the world alone. The book was published 3 years later by a small press in Denver. It did not become a bestseller, but it found its audience among the women of the frontier, who saw their own experiences reflected in its pages. Eleanor received letters from across the West, women thanking her for telling their stories, for acknowledging their struggles and celebrating their strength. One letter stood out from all the others. It came from a young woman in Wyoming who wrote, "I came west as a mail-order bride last year, terrified and alone. Your book helped me understand that I was not the only one who felt that way, and that a hard beginning does not mean an unhappy ending. Thank you for giving me hope." Eleanor cried when she read it, and Matthew held her, understanding without words what that letter meant to her. She had come full circle, from the desperate young woman on the platform to someone who could offer hope to others in similar circumstances. The children grew into adults. John took over more and more of the ranch operations, working alongside his father with an easy partnership that warmed Eleanor's heart. The twins went east for education, with Anna studying medicine and Rose falling in love with art. Both returned eventually, Anna to set up a practice in Gunnison, and Rose to paint the mountain landscape she had missed so desperately while away. Matthew's hair turned silver, and Eleanor's auburn locks gained threads of white. They moved a bit slower, their bodies bearing the accumulated aches of a lifetime of hard work. But their love remained constant, as steady and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. On a spring evening, 40 years after Eleanor had first arrived in Gunnison, they sat together on the porch as they had done thousands of times before. They were grandparents now, with John's 3 children and Anna's 2 filling the ranch with noise and laughter whenever they visited. "Do you have any regrets?" Eleanor asked, her hand in Matthew's, their fingers intertwined with the ease of long familiarity. Matthew was quiet for a moment, considering. "I regret that we did not have more time, that life goes by so quickly. I regret the moments I was impatient or short-tempered, the times I did not appreciate what we had. But regret about the life we built, about marrying you, about the family we created, not for a single second." He turned to look at her, his eyes still that remarkable gray blue, though surrounded now by wrinkles earned from a lifetime of smiling. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Walsh. From the moment I saw you crying on that platform to this very instant, you have been my joy, my partner, my love. If I had my life to live over, the only thing I would change is that I would find you sooner." Eleanor felt tears slide down her cheeks, but they were tears of happiness. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for 40 years, and I will love you for however many more we have." "Nobody makes you cry here," Matthew said softly, echoing those words from so long ago. "Except from happiness. Happy tears are allowed." Eleanor laughed, wiping her eyes. "You kept that promise. In all our years together, you have never once made me cry from sorrow. From joy, yes, from frustration occasionally, from laughing too hard at your terrible jokes, but never from sorrow." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The creek babbled its eternal song. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed. A nighthawk called as it swooped through the gathering dusk. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, built on a foundation of love that had started with a simple act of kindness on a train platform. Eleanor had arrived in Gunnison expecting nothing, but had found everything. She had been lost and was found, alone and became part of a family, crying and learned to laugh. And it all began because a cowboy with kind eyes had seen a woman in distress and decided that he would not walk away. He had promised that nobody would make her cry in this place, and he had spent the rest of his life keeping that promise. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Matthew stood and offered his hand to Eleanor. "Shall we go inside, my love?" Eleanor took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Even after all these years, his touch still sent a little thrill through her. They walked into the house together, Matthew's arm around Eleanor's shoulders, her arm around his waist, moving in the synchronized way of two people who had walked side by side for so long. They no longer had to think about matching their steps. Inside, the house welcomed them with warmth and the lingering scent of the dinner Eleanor had prepared earlier. Matthew banked the fire in the stove while Eleanor checked that the doors were locked and the lamps were extinguished. They moved through these nightly routines with the ease of long practice, a dance they had performed together thousands of times. In their bedroom, they undressed and climbed into bed, the same bed they had shared for 4 decades. Matthew pulled Eleanor close, her back against his chest, his arm draped over her waist. This was how they always slept, fitted together like two pieces of a puzzle. "Good night, my Eleanor," Matthew murmured into her hair. "Good night, my Matthew," she replied, covering his hand with hers. They drifted toward sleep, secure in their love, grateful for the life they had built, and content in the knowledge that tomorrow they would wake together and begin another day of their remarkable ordinary life. Outside, the mountains stood guard over the valley as they had for millennia. The creek sang its endless song. The wind whispered through the pines. And in a log house on a prosperous ranch, two people who had found each other at their lowest moments slept peacefully, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love that had transformed them both. Eleanor Grace had stepped off a train crying 40 years ago, broken and alone with no hope for the future. Matthew Walsh had seen her tears and made a promise. From that moment, everything had changed. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but because of simple human kindness, consistent action, and the choice to love deeply and completely every single day. It was a love story for the ages, though neither of them would have described it that way. To them, it was simply their life, the natural result of two lonely people finding each other and choosing to build something beautiful together. They had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs, raised children and built a legacy, and through it all, their love had been the constant that anchored everything else. As they slept, the moon rose over the mountains, casting silver light across the valley. The ranch slept too, the cattle settled in the meadows, the horses quiet in the barn, everything peaceful and secure. It was a small corner of a vast world, but to Matthew and Eleanor Walsh, it was everything. It was home, hard-won and deeply loved, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of commitment, and the enduring nature of true love. And in the morning, they would wake together as they had every morning for 40 years, grateful for another day, another chance to live the life they had built together. They would share coffee and conversation, go about their daily tasks, and find joy in the simple pleasure of each other's company. They would watch their grandchildren play, remember their own children's laughter, and look forward to whatever the future held, knowing they would face it together. Because that was what they did. That was who they were. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and created a love that had stood the test of time, a love that had grown and deepened and matured into something more precious than gold, more enduring than the mountains themselves. Matthew and Eleanor Walsh lived their love story every single day, not in grand romantic gestures, but in 1,000 small acts of kindness, patience, and devotion. They proved that the best love stories are not about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect people choosing each other and working every day to build something beautiful together. And it all began with tears on a train platform and a promise from a man with kind eyes who refused to let a stranger face her troubles alone. From that moment of compassion grew a lifetime of love, a family that would span generations, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The mountains bore witness to it all, standing eternal and unchanging while human lives played out in their shadow. They had seen Matthew Walsh grow from a boy to a man, had watched Eleanor Grace arrive broken and leave whole, had stood guard over a family as it grew and flourished. And they would continue to stand long after, a silent testament to all the small dramas of human life that unfolded beneath their peaks. But for Matthew and Eleanor, the mountains were not distant or indifferent. They were part of home, part of the life they loved. The mountains had sheltered them, challenged them, and provided the breathtaking backdrop for their remarkable ordinary life. When Eleanor looked at those peaks each morning, she saw not just geological formations, but the symbol of everything she and Matthew had built together, solid and enduring and beautiful. Their story became part of the local legend, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. The mail-order bride who stepped off the train crying, the cowboy who promised nobody would make her cry there, the love that grew from that moment into something that inspired everyone who knew them. People pointed out the Walsh Ranch as an example of what hard work and dedication could build. They spoke of Matthew and Eleanor with respect and affection, recognizing in them something rare and precious in a harsh land where survival often took precedence over sentiment. But to Matthew and Eleanor themselves, they were not legendary. They were simply two people who loved each other, who worked hard, who raised their children to be good people, and who found joy in the everyday miracle of waking up next to the person they loved most in the world. They did not think of themselves as special or remarkable. They thought of themselves as lucky, blessed to have found each other when they both needed it most. As the years continued to pass, their love remained the constant around which everything else revolved. Children grew and left and returned. The ranch changed and expanded. The town of Gunnison grew from a rough mining settlement into a proper town with schools and churches and even a library. But through all the changes, Matthew and Eleanor remained, their love the bedrock upon which everything else was built. They celebrated their 50th anniversary surrounded by family and friends, a gathering that filled their home and spilled out into the yard. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren, neighbors and friends from town, people whose lives had been touched by the Walsh family over the decades. There were toasts and tears, laughter and reminiscence, and through it all, Matthew and Eleanor sat hand in hand, smiling at each other with the secret joy of two people who had won life's greatest prize, the love of someone who truly saw them and loved them completely. John gave a speech, talking about what his parents had taught him about love and commitment, about hard work and integrity, about treating people with kindness and building something that would last. His voice broke as he spoke, and there was not a dry eye in the audience. Anna and Rose added their own words, stories of growing up with parents who showed them every day what true partnership looked like, who demonstrated that love was not just feeling but action, not just promise but fulfillment. When it was Matthew's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his body aged but his spirit undimmed. He looked at Eleanor, still beautiful to him after all these years, and then at the crowd of people who had come to celebrate with them. 50 years ago, he began, his voice still strong despite his age, I went into town on an ordinary day. I had no idea that my life was about to change forever. I saw a woman crying on the train platform, and something inside me just knew. I knew she was important. I knew I could not walk away. I did not know yet that I was looking at my future, at the person who would transform my life from a series of days to be endured into an adventure to be celebrated. He turned to Eleanor. You have given me everything, my love. You have given me a home, not just a house. A family, not just children. A purpose beyond mere survival. You have taught me what it means to truly love someone, not just in the easy moments but in the hard ones too. You have been my partner, my friend, my lover, my everything. And if I could go back to that day on the platform and do it all again, I would not change a single thing, except maybe to tell you sooner how much I loved you. Eleanor stood and moved into his arms, and they held each other while their family and friends applauded and cheered. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration not just of 50 years together, but of a love that had enriched everyone who witnessed it. The party lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than even such a large gathering could consume. Children played in the yard while adults talked on the porch. The older folks sat in chairs and watched with the contentment of people who had lived long enough to appreciate these moments of communal joy. As the stars came out and the guests began to depart, Eleanor and Matthew found themselves alone on the porch once more, sitting in their accustomed spots, holding hands as they had done for 50 years. It was a good party, Eleanor said. It was a good life, Matthew corrected. The party was just one night, the life is what matters. Yes, Eleanor agreed, and what a life it has been. They sat in silence, comfortable and complete. Around them, their ranch settled into night, everything familiar and dear. This was their kingdom, this small corner of Colorado, and they had ruled it with love and hard work and unwavering dedication to each other, and to the life they had built together. Matthew and Eleanor Walsh lived several more years, each one a gift they treasured. They slowed down gradually, passing more of the ranch work to John while they focused on the things that brought them joy. Eleanor continued to write, producing 2 more books that added to her legacy. Matthew worked with wood, creating beautiful furniture for his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, each piece made with care and love. They took walks together when the weather permitted, moving slowly but steadily, still pointing out things of interest to each other, still finding new things to talk about after more than 5 decades together. They read to each other in the evenings, shared meals made with ingredients from Eleanor's garden, and spent long hours simply being together, needing no activity or conversation to feel complete. When the end came for Matthew, it came quietly. He went to sleep one night in Eleanor's arms and simply did not wake up. The doctor said his heart had given out, worn down by age and a lifetime of hard work. He was 83 years old and he died peacefully, surrounded by love. Eleanor grieved deeply but without regret. She had had 55 years with the love of her life, had built a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were both gone. She missed him terribly, felt his absence like a physical ache, but she did not wish for their story to have ended differently. They had had their time, and it had been more than most people ever dreamed of having. She lived 3 more years, staying on the ranch that John now ran, surrounded by family who loved her and made sure she was never alone. She finished one final book, this one a memoir of her life with Matthew, and she dedicated it simply to Matthew, who taught me what love really means. On a spring morning much like the one when she had first seen the ranch, Eleanor passed away in her sleep. She was 79 years old, and those who saw her said she looked peaceful, even happy, as though she was going to meet someone she had missed terribly. They buried her next to Matthew on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that John had chosen, "Together forever." The ranch stayed in the family for generations, and the story of Matthew and Eleanor Walsh became part of its legend. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren heard the tale of the mail-order bride who stepped off the train crying, and the cowboy who promised nobody would make her cry there. The story changed slightly with each telling, as stories do, but the heart of it remained the same, a testament to the power of love, kindness, and the choice to see someone else's pain and do something about it. Years later, a great-granddaughter named Eleanor studied the history of mail-order brides for a college paper. She found records of her great-great-grandmother's arrival in Gunnison, read the original advertisement that had brought her west, and discovered in the town's newspaper archives a small notice about her marriage to Matthew Walsh, just weeks after her arrival. But more than the historical records, she had her great-grandmother Eleanor's books and her own family stories. She had the furniture that great-great-grandfather Matthew had made with his own hands. She had the ranch itself, still standing, still productive, still a testament to what 2 people could build when they worked together with love and dedication. She stood on the hillside where they were buried, looking out at the same view they had loved, and she felt the weight of their legacy. Not a burden but a gift, the knowledge that she came from people who had loved deeply, worked hard, and built something that endured. She understood in that moment on the hillside why the story had been told and retold through the generations. It was not just a romantic tale, though it certainly was that. It was a reminder of what mattered most in life, what endured when everything else faded away: love, kindness, compassion, the willingness to see someone in pain and refuse to turn away. The commitment to keep promises even when it was hard. The choice to build something together rather than face the world alone. These were the lessons of Matthew and Eleanor Walsh, and they were lessons worth passing on. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, as they had always stood, watching over the valley below. The creek still sang its endless song. The wind still whispered through the pines. And on a hillside overlooking a thriving ranch, 2 simple headstones marked the resting place of 2 people who had lived an extraordinary, ordinary life, who had transformed tears into laughter, loneliness into love, and despair into hope that had echoed through generations. It had all begun on a train platform in Gunnison, Colorado, on a cold March day in 1883, when Eleanor Grace stepped off a train crying, and Matthew Walsh saw her and made a promise. Nobody makes you cry here. It was a promise he kept for the rest of his life, and in keeping it, he gave them both everything that mattered. Their love story was not unique in its elements. People fell in love every day, but it was unique in its depth, its endurance, and its impact on everyone who witnessed it. They proved that the best love stories are not about perfect people or perfect circumstances, but about two people choosing each other, and then choosing each other again every single day, through joy and sorrow, triumph and hardship, for as long as they both lived. And that, ultimately, was the legacy of Matthew and Eleanor Walsh. Not the ranch, though it endured. Not the books, though they were still read. Not even the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, though they carried on the family name. The real legacy was the proof they provided that love, real love, was possible. That two strangers could meet at their lowest moments and build something beautiful together. That kindness mattered. That promises kept were worth more than gold. That a life lived with love was the greatest success anyone could achieve. The sun set over the mountains, as it had done every night for millions of years, and would continue to do for millions more. But for one perfect moment, the light touched the two headstones on the hillside, illuminating the names carved there. Matthew Walsh and Eleanor Walsh, together forever, just as they had promised each other on a spring day more than a century ago. And somewhere, perhaps in the whisper of wind through the pines or the song of the creek or the eternal presence of the mountains themselves, their love endured, a testament to all that was good and true and lasting in the human heart. They had lived. They had loved. They had built something that mattered. And their story, passed down through generations, continued to inspire anyone who heard it to believe that love, true love, was worth everything.